August 17th, 1943. 1 Field Hospital, Guadalcanal. Private James Dunbar lay shivering on a canvas cot, burning with fever. Outside, the jungle pressed against the tent walls, alive with the high-pitched whine of mosquitoes. His temperature had spiked to 105 degrees. Teeth chattering, despite the oppressive tropical heat, he clutched a threadbare blanket around his shoulders, while a Navy corpsman pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. Dunbar had never fired his rifle in combat. He'd been on the island for 6 weeks. In that time, he'd dug foxholes, hauled ammunition, and stood guard through rain-soaked nights. But he'd never
seen a Japanese soldier up close.
What got him wasn't a bullet or a bayonet. It was an insect smaller than his fingernail. The invisible enemy. The statistics tell a story most people never learned in history class. Between 1942 and 1945, malaria killed approximately 60,000 Allied soldiers in the Pacific Theater. Combat deaths in the same period, around 12,000. The mosquito proved 5 times deadlier than the enemy. This wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern that military commanders had failed to anticipate, failed to prepare for, and struggled desperately to contain once they understood the magnitude of the crisis. General Douglas MacArthur received the reports with mounting alarm. In some units stationed in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, infection rates exceeded 90%. Entire battalions were combat ineffective, not because of Japanese resistance, but because their men lay delirious with fever, racked by chills, too weak to hold a rifle. The Anopheles mosquito didn't care about rank or nationality. It infected Marines and soldiers, officers and enlisted men, with democratic efficiency. A single bite could deliver the Plasmodium parasite into the bloodstream, where it would invade red blood cells and multiply, triggering the characteristic cycle of fever, sweating, and rigors that could recur for months or even years. The geography of disease. The Pacific Theater presented perfect conditions for mosquito-borne illness. Unlike the European campaign, where armies maneuvered across open terrain and established bases in towns and cities, the Pacific War was fought in steaming jungles, fetid swamps, and coral atolls surrounded by stagnant water. New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, Burma. Every strategic objective seemed to be located in the most mosquito-infested environment imaginable. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Russell, a malariologist assigned to MacArthur's staff, surveyed the situation in late 1942 and recognized the scope of the disaster unfolding. "We're not fighting one enemy,"
he told his superiors.
"We're fighting 2. And right now, we're losing to both." The Japanese had prepared better. Their forces included extensive malaria suppression units. They'd studied tropical medicine for decades, drawing on experience from campaigns in China and Southeast Asia. They distributed quinine and later synthetic anti-malarials to their troops. They implemented mosquito control measures around their installations. The Americans, by contrast, had sent thousands of young men from temperate climates, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, into malarial zones with virtually no protection and minimal understanding of the threat. The initial medical supplies were inadequate. Quinine was in short supply, much of it coming from Java, which fell to Japanese control in early 1942. The synthetic alternatives were still being developed and tested. Mosquito netting was often absent or improperly used. Insect repellent was primitive and ineffective. Soldiers slept in open-air positions. They waded through swamps during operations. They established camps near standing water because it was often the only flat ground available. Every night, clouds of mosquitoes descended on these encampments, and every night, more men became infected. The medical crisis. Dr. Robert Kenny, a Navy surgeon stationed at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, kept detailed records of the malaria crisis as it unfolded. His notes from September 1943 describe hospital tents filled beyond capacity. "We have 400 beds," he wrote. "We're treating 700 patients. Men lie on the ground between cots. We're running out of quinine. We're running out of everything. The symptoms were brutal. The fever came in waves, spiking every 48 to 72 hours, depending on the parasite species. During acute episodes, body temperatures soared to 105 or 106 degrees. Patients experienced violent chills so intense their cots shook. They sweated through their bedding. They became delirious, crying out, seeing things that weren't there. Some developed cerebral malaria, where the parasite invaded brain tissue. These cases were often fatal. Others suffered black water fever, a complication where massive hemolysis, destruction of red blood cells, turned urine dark brown or black. The kidneys could fail. Death followed. Even mild cases were debilitating. A soldier with uncomplicated malaria lost his effectiveness as a fighting man for weeks or months. The recurring fevers meant he couldn't be counted on for continuous duty. He required medical evacuation, hospitalization, prolonged convalescence. The mathematics were devastating. A rifle company of 200 men might have 150 malaria cases within 3 months of deployment to a hot zone. Of those 150, perhaps 30 would be severe enough to require evacuation. Another 80 would be intermittently incapacitated by recurring symptoms. That left 70 effective soldiers, barely enough to maintain perimeter security, much less conduct offensive operations. Commanders faced impossible choices. Do you hold units in position, knowing they're being decimated by disease? Do you rotate them out prematurely, sacrificing strategic momentum? Do you commit fresh troops to areas where they'll inevitably become infected? The turning point. The solution came not from military leadership, but from the scientific community. In 1943, a breakthrough emerged. Atabrine, a synthetic anti-malarial drug developed by German chemists before the war, and now manufactured by American pharmaceutical companies. Atabrine worked. It suppressed the parasite. Soldiers taking daily doses remained functional even in highly endemic areas. But there was a problem: compliance. The drug turned skin yellow. It caused nausea in some users. Rumors spread through the ranks that it caused impotence or sterility, claims that were false but persistent. Soldiers threw away their pills. They pretended to take them during medical checks, then spat them out later. General MacArthur recognized this as a crisis of discipline, not medicine. In early 1944, he issued a direct order. Malaria suppression was mandatory. Officers would personally observe their men taking atabrine. Failure to comply would be treated as disobeying a direct order in wartime. The results were dramatic. Units with enforced atabrine compliance saw infection rates drop from 80 to 90% to below 10%. Entire divisions regained combat effectiveness. Simultaneously, aggressive mosquito control measures were implemented. Medical entomologists mapped breeding sites. Engineering units drained swamps, filled ditches, poured oil on standing water to suffocate mosquito larvae. Fogging operations dispersed insecticide around camps and installations. Soldiers received training in personal protection measures. Sleep under netting. Tuck pants into boots. Apply repellent to exposed skin. Use bed nets treated with insecticide. These simple steps, when followed consistently, reduced exposure significantly. By mid-1944, the malaria crisis was under control. Not eliminated, the disease continued to sicken thousands, but managed to the point where it no longer threatened entire operations. The human cost. The official statistics capture the scale. 60,000 dead from malaria versus 12,000 combat deaths. But numbers alone can't convey what those deaths meant. Each malaria fatality represented a failure of preparation, a gap in medical knowledge, a delay in implementing solutions that ultimately proved effective. Unlike combat deaths, tragic but inherent to warfare, these deaths were largely preventable. Private Dunbar survived his bout with malaria, though the disease recurred 3 more times before his discharge in 1945. He returned to Wisconsin, where the fevers continued to plague him sporadically for another decade. The parasite had taken up permanent residence in his liver, emerging periodically to invade fresh red blood cells and trigger new cycles of symptoms. He rarely spoke about his war service. When people asked, he'd mention Guadalcanal, and they'd assume he'd been in combat. He never corrected them. How do you explain that the worst enemy you faced was invisible? That the greatest threat came not from Japanese soldiers, but from something you couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't escape? The legacy. The Pacific malaria crisis reshaped military medicine. It demonstrated that tropical diseases could cripple modern armies as effectively as any enemy force. It proved that successful military operations required not just weapons and tactics, but comprehensive public health infrastructure. The lessons learned influenced everything that came after. During the Vietnam War, American forces deployed with extensive malaria prophylaxis programs in place from day one. Research into anti-malarial drugs accelerated. Military entomology became a recognized specialty. But perhaps the most profound legacy was psychological. The Pacific veterans knew a truth that subsequent generations often forgot. War isn't just about battles and bravery. It's about logistics, medicine, and the mundane struggle against environmental threats that don't make headlines but can determine outcomes as surely as any tactical engagement. The mosquito killed more American soldiers than the enemy did. That sentence still shocks people who hear it for the first time. It challenges our narrative of warfare, our understanding of what makes a conflict deadly, our assumptions about where danger comes from. And it reminds us that in war, the enemy you can't see might be the deadliest of all.